Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Bible and Archaeology podcast. As always, I'm Jordan Jones. I'm here with Dr. Bob Cargill. We're really glad to have you with us today for a popular and timely conversation. Today, we're going to be talking about looking at the Ten Commandments in the Bible and some of the conversation that's happening right now and that's also happened in history around the Ten Commandments and legislation and some of the questions that are probably immediately coming to your mind. Bob, thanks for taking the time today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
It's going to be a good conversation. It's a conversation that we need to have. And just so that everyone knows, we are going to be talking a little bit about some modern issues because this is in the news, right?
Yes, yes.
Louisiana just passed a law that said that the Ten Commandments must be displayed in public schools. Oklahoma just passed a law that said that the Bible must be taught in public schools. We typically avoid modern political issues. We try to stick to archaeology and biblical studies in its context in the Bible. But this is something that we need to address because it attempts, at least these laws are attempting, or modern politicians are attempting, to bring the Bible and use it as precedent for their claims, and we need to address this. So this needs to be addressed, and that's what we're going to do today.
Yeah, so our layout for today, we're going to do first some of that background. What does the Bible say? What are the Ten Commandments? Where do they show up? What are they really? Let's get our feet wet with that first. So if you're hearing our later conversation about some of the modern or some of these other conversations, you've got some of that background with you of what's the text say, where does it show up, before we get into all of that, so that we can all be more informed participants in these kinds of conversations. So some familiar ground, the term Ten Commandments, the name, it's a thing that most people, regardless of your faith affiliation, they're familiar with the name Ten Commandments. Maybe you've seen the movie and you're walking down the hill and you've got the two tablets with the Ten Commandments on them. But before we get into all of that, right, we're going to talk origin, where they show up, what they really say, and let's get right into that, Bob. What are the Ten Commandments? I think maybe let's start, right, when we say the Ten Commandments, when people are talking about it, what's the list that we think of? And I immediately go to that West Wing episode where there's a debate of the first commandment, and that's not the first. This isn't the first. So let's start there. When we think that generally assumed list of the Ten Commandments, what are they?
Okay, so right now, right at the beginning, we're answering we're starting with some of these trivia questions, right? How many commandments are there? Well, one, when we say there's no such thing as the Ten Commandments, this is because there are more than 10 commandments. So number one, there are more than 10 commandments. And I'm not just talking about 613 commandments, that are in the Jewish law that, they always say that there's. I'm talking within the 10 commandments, there are more than 10, meaning how you number them kind of tells us a little bit about who you are. But there aren't 10 commandments. Number two is they're not always called the 10 commandments. Sometimes they're called the 10 words. And that's because sometimes when they're given, they're just spoken. Other times they're written down. And so some of them are the words, these things that God said to Moses to tell Israel. And in another place, they're said, these are the things that God wrote down with his own finger. And what most people don't realize is in the event that it says that, the occasion that it says that, these aren't the ones that most people are familiar with. They don't match the 10 that most people are familiar with.
Right.
So right off the bat, 10 commandments is kind of a misnomer because they're more than 10. They're not always written down. Some of them are spoken. And let's just say it right up front, they don't match. They're given multiple times. Most people don't know that the 10 Commandments aren't just given once in the Bible. They're not just given twice in the Bible. They're actually given 3 times, if not more. Some scholars think they're given more than that. And that each time that they're given, the 10 Commandments don't match. So the first big question is, you want to put the 10 Commandments in a classroom? Which set of 10 commandments?
Yeah.
And the question we have to ask before that is the one that you just asked. What are the 10 commandments? So let's start there.
Let's start with that basic list of the assumed list, whether that's the biblically correct list or not, we can get into. What's that assumed first list?
Well, when you teach Jewish studies, when you teach Hebrew Bible, we all know that the first commandment is, I am the Lord your God. I am the Lord your God. Exodus 22. I am 22. I am the Lord your God. However, not all groups, Jewish groups, Christian groups, Catholic, Protestant, different groups, not all of them consider that the first commandment.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them think that is kind of a prologue. Well,
it's the preamble. You're warming up for the law.
How is that a commandment? But it is a commandment. It's like the ultimate commandment. I am the Lord, your God. And so that's the first commandment. But not all groups count it that way. They just count that as commandment 0, the lead up to the other commandment, which is, you will worship no other gods before me. Meaning, if we read it, there are other gods out there. You just can't worship any of those gods. You only worship the Lord. You worship Yahweh. You worship the Hebrew God, which becomes the Christian God. So you worship none of those other gods. You only worship that one God. None of the other gods before God. You can't make any idols, right? No graven images.
No graven images, no idols.
You can't make any image. You can't carve any images. You can't do no icons, no crucifixes. You can't do anything that has a face. You can't do anything that represents God. How does God appear in the Bible? He's coming out of a whirlwind. He's coming out of a cloud. He's coming out of smoke. He's coming out of fire, coming out of a burning bush. Mm-hmm. But you can't see him, right? So no images.
And we've talked some in an Ark of the Covenant conversation about this. So we're not going to get into the weeds of all of exactly the full arguments of each of the commandments. I think we can come back to that on another day. But the Ark of the Covenant is maybe immediately on some people's radar regarding idols and images, and we had that conversation. But right off the bat, I mean, we're 2 of the 10 commandments in, Bob, and you're already throwing some wrenches in the works of 10 of these commandments.
Well, I mean, again, I've said this on several occasions. What is the Ark of the Covenant? It's a wooden box overlaid in gold with mythological hybrid beings carved on the top. But don't call it an idol, because we don't worship idols. So what is it? I mean, this is why the Ark of the Covenant is so problematic later on, and basically it disappears and the temple takes its place. But that's another. I'm writing a book on this, but we'll talk about that later. What's the next one? Don't use the name of Yahweh. Don't use the name of the Lord in vain. Now, what does this mean? You can't say bad words using, God in it. I don't think you ought to do that, but that's not what this means. This means you can't swear an oath using the name of God, using the name of the Lord, and then break that oath. That's what that means. So you hear this, you talk in the Bible that you swear by the temple, you swear by the gold of the temple, you swear by all these different things to get around it. What you can't do is take an oath using the name of the Lord and then break the oath. You can't use the name of the Lord vainly. Does that include using, GD, and does that, okay, should you just be throwing around the name of God? It comes to mean,
right.
You don't even say fences around the Torah, right? We don't even say the name of God. We don't even write the name of God, right? It comes down, they would use different mechanisms to not even write the name of God. But what it means is there is holiness, sacredness for the very name of God. This is why you hear people, instead of saying the 4-letter name of the Tetragrammaton, they'll say the Lord when you read it, or they'll say, Adonai. They'll say Hashem, the name. They'll come up from these euphemisms for the name, the actual name of the Lord that is written throughout the Bible. So we don't use the name of the Lord in vain.
And it is interesting with this one that it's not just the full, what it comes to be later, that full prohibition of using it. It is in vain. It's not saying that you can't do it. It's saying no backsies, no take backs if you have gone in on this thing, which is an interesting difference from what I was taught, what it meant for me growing up is exactly the modern interpretation. Don't say these things, don't do these things, but not quite what we have there.
Right. Then the Jewish custom would become what we call a fence around the Torah from Mishnah Avot 1:1, right? You build a fence. You can't use the name of the Lord in vain if you never say the name of the Lord.
Right.
Right? You can't get hit by a car in the street if you don't play in the street. So this is why parents tell kids, don't play in the street. In fact, don't go in the front yard if I'm not out in front with you. So these are fences around the Torah. So that's where that tradition comes from. The next one, keep the Sabbath, right? Honor the Sabbath, keep it holy. By the way, the Sabbath is the last day of the week. The Sabbath is the last day of the week. The Sabbath is the last day of the week. The Sabbath is day 7. Why do we keep the Sabbath? Well, it depends on where you look. If you read Exodus chapter 20, it says, for in 6 days God created the heavens and the earth and all that's in it, and on the 7th day he rested, so you too will rest. But if you read Deuteronomy 5, it says, for you were slaves in Egypt, and God allowed you this opportunity to worship him, so you will take this rest so that you can worship the Lord. The rationale for the day of rest, the rationale for the Sabbath differs depending on whether you're reading Exodus 20 or whether you're reading Deuteronomy 5. Read it. Go take 2 Bibles, put them side by side.
Next to each other.
Yeah, put them next. If you're reading Exodus, the rationale for the Sabbath is Genesis, the creation. And if you're reading Deuteronomy 5, the rationale for the Sabbath is the Exodus. So which is it? Did God say 2 different things, right? Or did they have 2 different rationales for the Sabbath in 2 different givings of this law? But they're different. All we know is that the rationale for the Sabbath is different in these 2 different places. So which of those is going to go on the wall in Louisiana? Is it because of Genesis or is it because of Exodus that we keep the Sabbath? By the way, most people in Louisiana don't keep the Sabbath.
Well, when is the Sabbath? This is a question within this too of the what day would we be keeping?
The Sabbath is the 7th day of the week. Do not say, well, it's Sunday, it's the Lord's Day. No, that's the first day of the week. Read Acts. They came together on the first day of the the first day of the week is not the Sabbath. By the way, people who are going to worship at church on Sunday morning don't keep the Sabbath. What they do is they go out to Chili's afterwards. They go out to Applebee's. They go to eat, right? Right. And the Church of Christ people try to beat the Baptists. They try to get out half an hour early so they can beat the rush in there. Then
Pastor
they go
can't
home
talk for too long.
Yeah, you gotta go home and watch the NFL games because none of those guys are keeping the Sabbath, right? They've got to go mow the lawn. Nobody's keeping the Sabbath, even on a Sunday. And so, the Sabbath is the 7th day of the week. It's Saturday, not Sunday.
Right.
And you can't work on the Sabbath. Now, Jesus says a lot of things about the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. But there's no Jesus when these 10 commandments come down. You're talking about the 10 commandments, not the Beatitudes.
Correct.
You want to put the 10 commandments up there and say, this is the foundation for the law. And then what? You're not going to keep them? So this is the problem. This is one of the, but that's the next one. Then it says what? Honor your father and mother. Now, it doesn't say obey. It says honor. Honor your father and mother. That's the next one. We can talk, about what that means. Then you've got the 3 that everybody likes to point to. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not bear false witness. What I like to point out is do not murder, do not steal, and do not bear false witness are universal. please find me the religion. Please find me the philosophy, the ethical system that allows for this, right? You can't murder. You can't mess with somebody else's person, body. You can't steal. You can't take their stuff. You can't bear false witness, right? You can't lie under oath. You can't do this. The whole fundamentals of any kind of legal system collapse if you lie during the proceedings. So these are universal. These rules existed before the Hebrew Bible. You have them all the way back in Hammurabi's Law Code, and we'll talk more about this. But these aren't unique to the Hebrew Bible. These aren't unique to Judaism. They're not unique to Christianity. This is in every religious system around. And again, these are on pain of death, but you know, how many people are put to death for committing adultery these days? Anyways, and then you've got do not covet. And the coveting command is often broken up into two commands. And so depending on how people like to count these things. And so you've got do not covet your neighbor's wife, right? But then you've also got do not covet their property, right? Their slaves. You can't covet their modes of transportation. You can't covet their work vehicles, right? Their oxes and their donkeys and all their stuff. I always found this one interesting because coveting basically is the centerpiece of a capitalist economy, right? It's advertising, it's marketing, it's how hey, you need this new pickup. Look at this pickup. You don't have this, but you need to keep up with the Joneses. You need to buy this. It's what drives all social media with the advertising. It's you need this thing. You don't have this thing, but you want this thing. And then you start putting together plans and how am I going to get this thing? What do I need to do to get this thing? And it drives a capitalist economy, and you're forbidden to do it. And yet there are some people who say, no, this is the foundation of our legal system, and we need to put it out there. And yet it's completely forbidden. It's forbidden. And yet that's what drives the invisible hand of our anyways, those are the commands. And we're going to talk about.
To touch on the coveting one, you mentioned a little bit of a disagreement earlier in some of the ordering. We have the same thing happening in the do not covet, right? Between the Exodus and the Deuteronomy of what's the order. And you may say, that's not a big deal. Is it the house first or is it the wife first? In the scale of what do they say? Are they saying the same thing? It is there. But also when we're talking about an uncomfortable part of this do not covet is we're talking about property, right? So the do not covet, it is a listing of property. And among that, the neighbor's wife in the world of the Ten Commandments is listed amongst the neighbor's property that is not to be coveted. So within this, what are these things saying? It's also a conversation too. What are they saying? What's the behind the scenes of a part of that? So as we mentioned before, some of the disagreements, I wanted to make sure that one is in the audience's mind as well as we're thinking through, again, the stereotypical list of what are the Ten Commandments.
And again, Jordan's not saying that. This is the ancient text of the Bible that Jordan's not saying that women are property.
Yes.
Yes, just so don't send us bad. The Bible's saying this. Remember the back half of these 10 commandments, or there's more than 10, but are property rights. Don't mess with other people's person. Don't mess with other people's stuff. Don't steal, right? Don't bear false witness against them. Don't covet their things. And yeah, that's how women were treated. It's, I always jokingly, not kidding, not kidding, talk about the patriarchy and the problems that we have with the patriarchy. And this is one of the issues, right? Women were just above donkeys and oxes when it came to this kind of stuff. Did they have a few more rights? Yeah, but not many. And here they are listed here. You can't covet somebody's wife or their house or their ox and their... These are the 10 commandments that we want posted. Some people want posted in the, just to remind people about what property is.
And so within this, right, if this is the stereotypical list, Bob's thrown out a couple references. That listing comes to us from the Exodus 20 and the Deuteronomy 5, roughly. They're not identical, they're close. And so within those, something that I think is worth noting before we get to Exodus 34, which is one of his third options, the name 10 Commandments, right? We talked about this, the 10 words or the 10 frayings or sayings. Commandment is kind of an interesting translation there. But in Exodus 20 and in Deuteronomy 5, they're not actually called the 10 Commandments in relation. The Deuteronomy one, you can say, okay, it shows up a little before or after and it's being read towards this. But the one that is called the 10 Commandments is Exodus 34. The one that's actually called the 10 Commandments. And that one, Bob, I think would surprise some people of what's in there because that has the commandments that are way outside what we think of when we think of the 10 Commandments.
And remember, Exodus 34 is the event. And I like to point this out. Moses comes down with his 10 Commandments. He sees them. They've made a golden calf. He gets angry. He smashes them on the ground. Right? He has some people killed. And then God tells him, come back up the mountain and I will write with my own finger, right? That's what the text says. I will write with my own finger a copy of the words that had been written on the previous tablets.
Correct.
So God, the text is saying, I will make a copy of the very commandments that were on the previous tablets.
And God's going to make the copy.
God's going to do it himself.
God's doing it. Right.
So according to the Bible, according to the biblical text, this is going to be a carbon copy, right? By God himself, by the finger of God, of these 10 commandments. And so they should read exactly like Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. And when Moses comes down, we get Exodus 34:1. The text says, literally, the Lord said to Moses, cut 2 tablets of stone like the former ones, and I will write on the tablets the words that were on the former tablets, which you broke. That's how Exodus 34 begins. Now, when we look at Exodus 34, what are the commandments? Does it say, I am the Lord your God? You will not worship any gods before me, no graven images. Does it have that same list? Here's what it says. Look at 34:12. Don't make a covenant with the Canaanites. Huh? Keep the festival of unleavened bread. Huh? The first offspring of every womb belongs to me. Huh? Don't offer the blood of a sacrifice with leaven. Don't boil a young goat in its mother's milk, which is basically a law against animal cruelty, but it's the law that most people point to where we get you can't mix milk and meat for the kosher rule. Now, look at those. By the way, how does Exodus 34 end? What's the if we look up Exodus 34 at the end of the chapter, if we look through all of these extra rules, Exodus 34:27, the Lord said to Moses, write these words in accordance with the words I have written with you. And he wrote, look at 34:28, and he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 Commandments. And so Exodus 34, the Bible itself, claims that these are the 10 Commandments.
Right.
But those commandments look nothing like Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. I would love to see somebody put a copy of Exodus 34 up in the classroom.
Well, and if the argument is it's the 10 Commandments, the 10 Commandments is what's supposed to go up. If we take, let's be literal about the classifications of the Bible. The one that is explicitly classified is Exodus 34.
What it says.
goodbye cheeseburgers in the classroom, right? That's the one, which is, as we're talking through, why are we laying out, and we're starting to dip our toes into the modern thing, but laying out the three versions of this is because if you're going to do this, there's a decision that gets made of which one of these. And as you've mentioned, how are they numbered? How are they understood? All of this that gets wrapped in this behind the scenes material that gets sorted through normally within traditions or denominations or biblical texts. That's a part of this conversation of what are we talking about when we say the 10 Commandments? Because it's not right, cut and dry. It's not written in stone which are exactly the 10 and which aren't.
That's right. That's exactly right. And the other problem, of course, that we have is how we number these.
Yeah.
So the first problem, the primary problem with any kind of modern legislation there's multiple problems, but the first problem is which set of 10 commandments? Exodus chapter 20, Deuteronomy chapter 5, or Exodus 34? Because they're different. Mm-hmm. Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5 are similar, but you've got some differences, specifically the rationale for the Sabbath command. Mm-hmm. Not that we keep the Sabbath command anyway, but we'll get to that. But Exodus 34, the one that's actually called the 10 Commandments, is completely different. And that's not the one that most people are familiar with. Again, go read your Bible. I'm always astonished at the people who are pounding on the Bible the most and trying to legislate it are the ones that know it the least. Go read it. These aren't the commandments, the ones that are actually called the 10 Commandments are not the ones that people want to put up in the classroom. The second issue is if we actually look at the 10 Commandments and call them up, we'll see that they are actually numbered differently. Now, I mentioned that that's because there are more than 10.
Right.
And I mentioned right off the top that I am the Lord your God is considered to be commandment number 1 by the Jewish faith. I am the Lord your God is commandment number 1. And commandment number 2 is don't have any other gods before me and don't make any graven images. You can't do that. That's one commandment together. No other gods, no graven images. That's number 2. Number 3 is don't take my name in vain. Number 4 is remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. So according to the Jewish tradition, this is how you count them. And the Catholic tradition also says that I am the Lord your God is the first commandment, but it groups it together with no other gods before me and don't make any graven images. That's all one command.
Right.
The second command is don't take the Lord's name in vain. So now you've already got 2 different groups with 2 different ways of numbering these things. Whereas the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, says, no, I am the Lord your God isn't a commandment. The first commandment is no other gods before me, which is where a lot of Protestant groups pick up. And so you've got different groups right from the beginning counting the first commandment differently, which means you've got to number the back end of it differently. So some groups split up the coveting command. Some of them say all of the coveting commands, covet your neighbor's house, covet your neighbor's wife, covet the neighbor's animals. That's all one command. Whereas other groups split up the coveting commands into different commandments. Mm-hmm. So don't covet your neighbor's wife is one command, but don't covet all the other possessions is number 10, is a separate command. And so again, and we're not even talking about atheists and agnostics. And that's what, you atheists, you agnostics you don't like God. We're talking about various confessional groups, different members who believe in God, members of different groups of faith who believe in God. They don't agree on what the 10 Commandments are. So within the Bible, you've got at least 3 giving of the 10 commandments, which don't match with each other. And Exodus 34, the one that calls itself the actual 10 commandments, doesn't look anything like Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. And then once we go with Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, we don't know how to number them because all of the different faith groups disagree on how to number them.
The 10 Commandments are so easy though, right, Bob? They're supposed to be, they're not easy at all. Anytime we're getting into this stuff, and this is outside of the debates of which is the oldest, there's the scholarly debates of this text might be older than that text, this is the ritual version, that's the ethical version. There's all of that that's happening in a scholarly debate as well. But just within, as you're mentioning, just within the communities of faith that hold and abide by and want to affirm these things, there's disagreements of what are they? Which text do we point to? What's their number? Before we even get to things like what do they mean, just what do they say gets complicated. So then let's jump fully then into the modern thing of the this week in the news side of this. And as you mentioned, where this conversation isn't brand new. No. There's the situation in Louisiana and Oklahoma. This isn't the first time that such ideas or legislation has been proposed. It won't be the last time either. So this conversation is aware of those things, but not directly tied to them. But in this issue of we want to put these things forward. Bob, as you mentioned, it's not just about the atheist or the agnostic.
No.
In America, there have been traditions, unfortunate histories of religious conflict between faith groups that this seems to be unaware of how it could be sparking off this kind of debate. If 10 commandments go up, which version? And you go home and say, this is what I have in class. That could be a problem depending on what your tradition is.
Yeah. I mean, imagine, if you will, again, the straw person that's put forward is atheists and agnostics don't like religion in the classroom and they're ungodly and they want this nation to go to hell in a handbag. That's always held up. And by the way, that's a valid argument, right? The atheists and agnostics don't like having religion pushed at them in a taxpayer-funded classroom, to be sure. But that's not where the biggest resistance is going to come from. Let's start with first the Oklahoma legislation, where Bible must be taught in the classroom. Let's start there before we come back to the 10 Commandments. Imagine, if you will, a kid coming home from class today saying, Dad, we read the Bible in class. I'm so excited we finally get to read God's word in class. And Dad, who happens to be a Baptist minister, says, oh, son, that's great. What did you read today? And he goes, today we read from First Maccabees, and we read about how God and son, and the dad says, whoa, First Maccabees? That's not the Bible. Oh, sure it is. We read it in class. Our teacher said that First Maccabees is part of the Bible. And he gets on the horn and starts calling the parent PTA, and he starts calling the school board. And now we've got a big controversy between the Catholics, maybe the teacher's Catholic, who's reading from First Maccabees, which Catholics consider to be part of their canon, and some Baptist parents who say that's not part of our canon. Remember that the founders didn't get religion out of politics, right? They didn't do this separation between because of atheists and agnostics. It was this inner religious conflict. It was Catholics and the Church of England, right? It was this inability to come to terms between different religious groups, right? Imagine we read from the Wisdom of Sirach today, and we can't even decide what the canon of the Bible is, depending on whether you're Catholic or Protestant. So how are you going to teach? And then what? Are we going to decide, okay, let's just read from the Protestant Bible? How are the Catholics going to respond to that?
Right.
Now bring us back to the 10 Commandments. We're going to read the 10 Commandments, but we're going to number them the way the Protestants do it, not the way the Catholics do it. If you're a Jewish child, sweet, it's the 10 Commandments. You should be proud of the fact that your that's not our 10 Commandments. That's not how we number those 10 Commandments. By the way, you're not keeping that. That's those aren't our 10 Commandments. That's not commandment number 1. So now you've got Jewish groups saying, those are our commandments. That's our tradition.
And you're doing it wrong.
You're not even representing it properly, right? You can't even get our tradition properly. And the Christians will say, well, it's our tradition too. Now we're dealing with supersessionism.
Yeah.
What do you mean it's your tradition? Jesus, I thought, got rid of the Sabbath. This is the problem. The problem is not they're going to get sued, and they're going to get sued by atheist groups, and they're going to get sued by the Church of Satan, and they're going to get sued by some Buddhist group and some Hindu group and some Muslim group who wants to put their holy scriptures on the wall as well. That's all going to happen. But the biggest conflict is going to come from other religious groups, Christian groups, Jewish groups, confessional groups, people of faith who are going to say, hey, that's not how we do this. And what's going to end up happening is any responsible legislative body, any responsible judicial body is going to say, you know what, this is probably why the founders removed all this. It wasn't because of atheists and agnostics. It was because of right? Other confessional groups, inner religious conflict. Well, that's why they did it.
A group of Louisiana clergy have already filed one of these motions against it. And in their statement, they say this law requires a specific state-approved version of that scripture to be posted, taking sides on theological questions regarding the correct content and meaning of the Decalogue. So as you're saying, right, this is going to be one of these internal battles. It will largely, a lot of the focus will go towards external communities, but that internal, is it ours? Yep. Is it yours? What happens? There were riots in the 1840s connected to a similar practice where the Bible was read in school, and then there was a Catholic and a Protestant conflict over which version of the Bible are we reading. That was tied into anti-immigrant sentiments and xenophobic sentiments. And you may say that was in the 1840s. That's a long time ago. But this is something that happened here. This is something that happened around similar legislation because it required a decision of your Bible or their Bible, my Bible or that Bible. That when it makes you pick, and from which one and which numbering, we start to get complicated before we even deal with the question of First Commandment and First Amendment. Before we get to that, just in that, which one do we pick? Then we have this issue.
Before we even get there, what happens if an immigrant, member of the Ethiopic church, right? Somebody who let's set it up as elaborate as we can. Somebody immigrates to this country, member of the Ethiopic church. By the way, people from the Ethiopic church, Enoch, First Enoch is part of their canon. And so they're like, can we read from First Enoch? Most of these elementary school teachers are going to say, I've never even heard of First Enoch.
What's Enoch?
But that's part of our Bible. Can we read from Enoch? And now you got the Catholics and the Protestants saying, yeah, we're not going to read that. Well, why not? You said we could read Bible. That's in our Bible. That's part of our canon. That's part of the tradition. Now, why are we reading your Bible? It's not going to come from the atheists it will come from the atheists, but that's not where the most heated debates are going to come. It's going to become freaking North Ireland again, right? It's the very thing that caused them to leave Jesus and God and the Bible out of the Declaration of Independence and out of the Constitution to begin with. So you have there's not 10 commandments. We don't even know how to count them. The 3 offerings of the 10 commandments don't match, so we don't know which ones to put on the wall. And the conflict is going to come from these interreligious groups that are just going to fight. Now we have the issue of, we don't keep these commandments anyway. So this argument, and this is our next issue, this argument that the 10 commandments are the fundamental basis of our modern American law code is completely bogus. And it's completely bogus because we don't keep these laws. The only ones we keep, do not murder, do not steal, do not bear false witness. The only ones that we keep are universal to all religions. They're not unique to Christianity. They're not unique to Judaism. And therefore, they're not unique to the American or the Western civilization. Every culture does this. And let's do the first one. What is the first commandment? However you want to number it, right? Let's rattle them off. I am the Lord your God. You may not worship any other God before me. So the first commandment in the Bible that they want to post all over these public is you may not worship any other God upon pain of death.
Right.
And yet the First Amendment to the Constitution says that the government will establish no laws, right, establishing any religion or preventing the practice thereof, right? That the state doesn't establish any religion, and you can't be prosecuted for your practice of whatever religion you choose. So what it comes down to is the first commandment, which says you may only worship one God upon pain of death, is diametrically opposed to the First Amendment to the Constitution, which says you can worship whatever God you want. How is the first commandment the fundamental basis of our laws if the First Amendment says the exact opposite of the first commandment? You cannot make an argument that the Ten Commandments are the fundamental basis of our modern law system, of our history. Our First Amendment says the exact opposite. You have to pick one. Must you worship one God and only one God? Or is the First Amendment something of value and we have to preserve it? Which is it? You can't do both, right? Can you make graven images? Can Catholics wear a crucifix? Yes or no? Can Orthodox Christians have religious icons in their church? Yes or no? Because that violates what some people in Louisiana are arguing is a fundamental basis of our American law. And if we're going to violate the fundamental basis of our American law, a historical basis of our American law, then what are we doing, right? You can't say the Lord's name in vain. That's violating the First Amendment.
Right.
You can't say these words. You can't use the name of God in whatever sense. You have free speech or you don't. You have free speech or you don't. So that's 3, right? You can work on the Sabbath. Yes or no? Can you or can you not? So there's 4.
And if you do, we kill you, right?
Yeah, you pick up sticks on the wrong day of the week, you're gone. You play football on Sunday. You want it? If it's Sunday or is it Saturday? Which is it?
College football players or NFL players, one of them are getting.
You're going to kill somebody, right? We're going to kill a lot of people. No more NIL, right? Everybody's dead, right? So there's 4 laws. Honor your father and mother. Well, good grief, right? We're going to kill a lot of children, right, for dishonoring their parents, and we're going to kill a lot of adults for dishonoring their. That's not a fundamental basis of our. There's 5. So how far along are we going to go here? Well, now we're not honoring. So don't murder, don't steal, right? Don't bear false witness. Those are universal. How about committing adultery? Do we kill people for committing adultery? No. Is it a good idea? No. But you know what? Neither is coveting. Oh, wait, coveting. That's the driving force behind a capitalist economy. That's marketing. People have careers on advertising and marketing, and that's how you get Facebook for free. That's how you get YouTube for free. You have to watch ads. Mm-hmm. It's advertising is. So this notion that and there's more than 10 commandments, but this notion that because do not murder, do not steal, and do not bear false witness, 3 of the whatever it is, 12, because we got 3 of them, which happen to be universal to all religions and all cultures, happen to align, that somehow makes this 10 commandments the foundation of our is just nonsense. It's silly, it's ridiculous, it's foolish, and anybody who says otherwise is wearing blinders, right? They're looking for the speck in the other eye and they don't see the beam. It's illogical, It can't be held up in any kind of, let's say, objective court. You can't do it. It's why the founders did what they did way back then. Am I preaching too much?
You're right, and it gets connected to the backstop, because there's usually the little bit of hedging that people know that there's going to be the pushback to this. So then they reach next to Moses as this first lawgiver idea of whether it's these law or Moses as the law, this first law that set these things up, ignoring things like the Code of Hammurabi.
Moses
that are precedents.
That's right. You are right. Moses wasn't the first lawgiver.
No. And we know we have the archaeological evidence for other laws before this one, things like the Code of Hammurabi that are very similar in format and in text to a lot of what we see in the Bible. So oopsies, who's borrowing from who is a whole other conversation. But if we're saying we need to base it off the first lawgiver instead, well then, okay, we need to go to something like Urnamu or Hammurabi, and that's going to be the precedent that we go with. Arguments of, in Louisiana, the governor said some things about what's in the Supreme Court. The 10 Commandments are on the doors of the Supreme Court, which on the back of the doors, there's 2 tablet-looking things with the Roman numerals 1 through 10. Is that the 10 Commandments? Is that the Bill of Rights? It doesn't have text.
So 2 things on that. One, but it's historical. So the other claim is now it's historical. But the 10 Commandments are historical documents. No, they're not. The Bill of Rights, maybe. The Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, those are historical documents. And if the Bible is a historical document and the 10 Commandments are historical documents, then there are a lot of other people with a lot of other religions in this country, including all of the Native American traditions, that need to be posted in classrooms around the country, right there next to it. Exactly like it is in the Supreme Court. You mentioned the doors of the Supreme Court. 2 tablets, 1 through 10, but it's just the Roman numerals. There's
just
no
the
text.
Numbers.
So is it 1 through 10, 10 Commandments, or is it 1 through 10, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments? Then they say, no, if you look up at the top of the frieze there in the Supreme Court, it's got Moses holding the 10 Commandments. But look next to Moses. I called this up. Who do you have? You have Menes, right? The first Pharaoh of Egypt who brought together, who unified Upper and Lower Egypt. You have Hammurabi, who we've already mentioned, who gave this famous first law code, from which many of the laws in the Bible are taken, often word for word, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, things like this. You have Moses, right? Moses is there with his 10 Commandments. So good. You're right. Moses is there with his 10 Commandments, right there next to Menes and Hammurabi. Solomon, okay, great, known for his wisdom. But you've also got, who else do we have?
We got Lycurgus, we have Solon, we have Draco.
Yeah, not Iowa Solon, right?
Yes, ancient lawgivers. It's all these ancient lawgivers.
Correct.
Among them all, Moses.
Right. Confucius, Octavian, Justinian, Muhammad is up there, right? Charlemagne, right? They put them all up there side by side. But for some reason in Louisiana, they just want to got their blinders on. They just want to put the 10 Commandments. And they say, well, look, it's on the Supreme Court. Yeah, along with Confucius and Muhammad. And this is the point. You cannot logically, rationally, in good faith, without doing these mental backflips, you cannot make this case, because the very first commandment violates the First Amendment. Who can you worship? Do you worship the Lord only, or can you worship whoever you want? Pick one. They're diametrically opposed. So, I mean, any one of these points, we don't know how to number them. We don't even know what they are. They don't match within the Bible.
Yeah.
And any one of these points just demonstrates how bad this law is. And all this law is an attempt to try to force a Christian perspective. This isn't coming from Jews around the country, right? This isn't the Jewish faith trying to force Judaism. And this is coming from evangelical Christians, conservative evangelical Christians, trying to force Bible into the curriculum. That's all this is. During an election year, by the way, notice when this law was passed. They're trying to get people to the ballot box. That's it. This isn't going to stand up to any objective Supreme Court.
And we've had a similar case to the Supreme Court before in the 80s, Stone versus Graham, that ruled a similar law was unconstitutional. So yes, as we said, there's particular examples now that we're having this conversation because of. But this has a history of appearing before. It will have a future of appearing again after whatever happens here. Inevitably, other things, similar things will be proposed. But as we're hoping to go through today, there's always backstory questions to ask of which version are they using, how are they reading it, what's the traditions behind this. The weeds underneath these things are always far more complicated than I think what our memory might tell us about, well, what are the 10 Commandments? Oh, I'll rattle them off. Except that's not what it says, or where does it say it? So it's complicated. Now, I'm sure we'll have some responses to this, and that's absolutely fine. You can leave it in the comments. You can send us an email at bible-archaeology@uiowa.edu. We would love to hear from you on this. If you have things you'd like to add, additional questions you'd like to add. In the future, we'll come back to the 10 Commandments because I think it would be worth kind of walking through some of the interpretive hurdles that are in this. Like, what do these things really mean that we can go through on another day? We got to break things up a little bit for people. So we'll come back to the 10 Commandments in the future, but let us know your thoughts. If you're listening along today, you can also find us, if you're an audio-only fan, on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify. You can find us here on YouTube. Subscribe to wherever is convenient for you. We'll be back with more, I'm sure, some follow-up with this, because next week we're going to do a free-for-all episode where we're just going to be responding to comments and questions. So if you have something you'd like to hear from quickly, next week we'll be live on YouTube. And you can come and ask your questions or give your feedback to this. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to see you there. But for today, Bob, is there anything you want to end with as we try to put a bow on this monster of a conversation that is, what are the 10 Commandments, where are they, and what are we trying to do with this? How do we wrap this up?
Yeah, I would say, we're not even getting into do not kill or do not murder. We talked about what does it mean to take the Lord's name in vain. We're just talking about the complete irrationality, I would say irresponsibility, of trying to force the 10 Commandments into public classrooms. And I just want, maybe some of you, maybe some of our listeners haven't or weren't aware of the problems, that weren't aware that there were more than 10 Commandments.
Yeah.
Weren't aware that different groups counted them differently, weren't aware that that they were given multiple times and that when they were given, they didn't match. So we wanted to bring these ideas to the forefront. And again, if you have questions, send them to us via email, send them to us via Patreon, or tune in next week for our Friday free-for-all. We welcome the questions. I like questions. I get them all the time in email. Send them to us and let's talk about it.
That's what we're here for. We're here for these types of conversations. We want to hear from you. So hopefully you reach out if you got a question. Hopefully we see you next week there live on YouTube. You can come and join us and ask your questions then. Or we look forward to seeing you or being in touch with you next week. You can find us here, Bible and Archaeology, on Apple, on Spotify, on YouTube, on all the places that you want to find us. Stay in touch. But for today, I'm Jordan Jones. This is Dr. Bob Cargill. Thank you for joining us. For everyone here at Bible and Archaeology, thanks for tuning in. Until next week.